A man the size of a barn door stood on a train platform in Wyoming holding a fistful of red wildflowers. That was the first wrong thing. The second wrong thing was the woman who came down from the second car. Canvas riding skirt. Lariat on her shoulder. The look of someone who measured distance in days on horseback and had been doing it since she was old enough to own a horse. She raised one hand and stopped him cold before he closed half the distance. 3 words came out of her mouth. Whatever he had been expecting, it was not those 3 words. Something moved through his face that nobody on that platform could afterward describe precisely. He lowered the flowers. Somewhere across town, a man who stood to inherit 12,000 acres was already watching the clock. The woman turned to leave. He said the thing that changed everything. The morning train into Rimrock Station came in loud and slow, the way morning trains always did, breathing steam across the platform boards in great gray exhales that swallowed a man's boots if he stood too close to the tracks. Wes Harlan did not stand too close. He stood where he always stood when he was waiting on something that mattered, which was 15 feet back from the edge, with his weight settled and his hands visible, and his eyes tracking every window from the second car forward. He was the largest man on the platform by enough margin that it stopped being a comparison and became a category. 6 feet 3 inches of Wyoming rancher, shoulders wide enough that the 2 men standing nearest him had each, without discussing it, drifted another step sideways over the past 10 minutes. His hands were the size of a working man's hands after 10 years of working, which meant they were the size of things that did not belong in polite company, and he was holding in them a fistful of red wildflowers. He had cut himself at first light from the south bank of the Platte, where they came up every April without asking permission. The flowers looked wrong. Not because they were bad flowers. They were good flowers, low-growing, the color of something that meant business. They looked wrong because they were in his hands. And his hands were built for wire stretchers and calf pullers and the kind of that left marks, and the flowers were not that kind of thing. He was aware of this. He had been aware of it since he cut them. He had cut them anyway, because it was a bride's first morning in Wyoming, and a man met that with what he had, and what he had this morning was the south bank of the Platte, and 29 days left on a clock his father had wound from the other side of death. 29 days until his 30th birthday. 29 days until the condition in August Harlan's will either held or failed, and took 12,000 acres of strong Wyoming grass with it one direction or the other. Half of Rimrock Station had turned out for the occasion without being invited, which was how things worked in a town of 400 souls strung along a river bend in the high country. Edna Marsh stood in front of her bakery, with her arms crossed in the manner of a woman who had somewhere better to be, and had simply not gotten around to going there. The station agent had developed an urgent interest in the far end of the platform, which happened to face the tracks directly. 3 hands from the lumber operation leaned against the loading dock, with the studied ease of men who had agreed not to stare and were already staring. Wes understood, without looking at any of them, that whatever happened on this platform in the next 10 minutes would be the version of events that Rimrock Station carried forward. A man met his bride well, or he did not. A ranch stayed whole, or it didn't. In a town of 400 people, those 2 facts had never been separate questions and were not separate questions now. He watched the windows. The train slowed with the grinding patience of something large that had come a long way, and was in no particular hurry about the final distance. Steam moved across the platform in slow rolls. Wes tracked the second car from the moment it came into sight, looking for a particular face. A Boston face, he had told himself, though he could not have described what he meant by that with any precision. Composed, maybe. A woman who had written careful letters for 6 months about open range and clear air and the kind of life she was prepared for. He had a clear picture of those letters and almost no picture of the woman who had written them, which was a thing he had not let himself examine too closely, because examining it too closely led somewhere. He did not have time to go with 29 days on the clock. What came down from the second car was not a Boston face. She came down the steps the way a person came down from a horse as they had ridden hard. Controlled, economic, no motion wasted. The coat she wore was men's wool, 2 sizes wrong. The kind of coat grabbed in a hurry because the morning was cold and her own was doing something else. Her canvas riding skirt had gone pale at both knees from exactly the kind of work that put wear on fabric at both knees. The flannel shirt beneath the coat was the deep blue of something that had been washed 100 times and had stopped fading because there was nothing left to fade. A coiled lariat hung from the strap of her travel bag the way another woman might carry a folded fan. Not as decoration, as a tool she happened not to be using at this particular moment. She had the look of someone who measured distance in days on horseback and had been doing it since she was old enough to own a horse. Wes stepped forward with the flowers doing the majority of the thinking. She stopped him with one hand raised before he closed half the distance. Not unkind, just definite. The same gesture you used on an animal cutting the wrong direction when you needed it cutting right. You bought the wrong bride. 3 words. Enough to do considerable damage to a fistful of red flowers and 29 days of careful planning and whatever remained of a Wednesday morning in April. Wes Harland stood on the platform of his own town in front of 40 people he had known since boyhood. And something moved through his face that nobody watching could afterward describe precisely. It was not embarrassment. It was not anger. It was the expression of a man who has just heard the thing he was half expecting and is deciding in real time how he intends to carry it. He lowered the flowers. He held out his hand. Glad to meet whoever you are then. The words came out even, unhurried, because a woman had ridden or walked or otherwise transported herself across considerable distance to deliver bad news in person to a stranger. And that was not a small thing, and a man who had been raised right recognized it whether his morning was going well or not. Later, the station agent would tell 3 different people it was the strangest thing he had ever seen on a train platform. He had watched men receive worse news in that same spot. Not one of them had led with a handshake. Her name was Ada Voss. She had not come to marry anyone. 3 days earlier, she had been attending to her own business entirely, which was cattle and ledger columns and the particular mathematics of moving 40 head of commercial beef from a loading pen in Laramie to a buyer's yard outside Rimrock without losing weight on the animals or time on her schedule. She was 26 years old, born in Texas, and she had been moving stock along the rail lines for her father's outfit since she was 19. It was work that suited her, the way outdoor work suited people who became uncomfortable indoors after more than 2 consecutive days. Not a preference exactly. More a fact of how she was constructed. She was in the second car because the stock car smelled like what it was, and she had already checked her animals twice that morning, and they were fine. Ida Holt was in the second car because she had nowhere else to be. Ida had answered Wes Harland's matrimonial notice from a sitting room in Boston 6 months prior, drawn by a description of open range and clear air and a working ranch she had pictured, with considerable confidence and very little accuracy, as something resembling a large and well-appointed country estate. The correspondence through the winter had been pleasant. Wes wrote plainly and without pretension, which she had taken as a mark of good character, and which was a mark of good character. Only she had perhaps not fully reckoned with what it also meant about the life that produced it. She had packed accordingly. 4 dresses unsuited to every task Wyoming would ever ask of her. A hat box, a trunk of household linens in patterns she had chosen for a house she had not seen, watching the trees thin out, and the ground go flat and enormous and scrubbed of every familiar shape in every direction. Ida Holt understood something that no amount of pleasant correspondence had prepared her for. Wyoming was not a large and well-appointed country estate. Wyoming was Wyoming. It went on past the point where going on seemed reasonable, and then it went on further, brown and wind-raked and indifferent to every arrangement she had made. She sat rigid as the train slowed into Rimrock Station, staring straight ahead while the conductor made 3 separate requests of increasing desperation. Her trunk was already on the platform. She could see it through the window. She did not move. What she did instead was reach out and grab the nearest sleeve that looked like it belonged to someone capable of handling a difficult errand without coming apart. That sleeve belonged to Ada Voss, returning from her second cattle check of the morning. Please. Ida's voice had come apart at the seams in the way of something that had been holding together through considerable effort and had run out of effort. There is a man on that platform with flowers. He has been writing to me for 6 months. I cannot get off this train. I know how that sounds. I cannot look at his face when he hears it, and I need someone to take this letter out to him and tell him, because I cannot be the one to say it. I cannot. Ada looked at the letter. She looked at the window. She looked at the platform where a man the size of a barn door was watching the train with the kind of focused attention that was almost painful to observe from a distance, the attention of someone who had practiced waiting by doing it badly for a long time, and had finally gotten good at it. There was no reason in the world to say yes. She had a buyer waiting. She had 40 head drawing feed costs out of her margin every hour they sat in the stock pens. She had a connecting schedule that would not hold for sentiment. She took the letter because someone had to, and the person standing at the door was her. She had planned to be back on the train in 2 minutes. Hand over the letter, say the plain version, walk away while the man was still absorbing it. Clean, efficient, done. That is not what the 2 minutes became. There is a letter. Ada held it out once his hand had come back down from the shake she had accepted, because a handshake offered honestly deserved to be taken honestly, even on a platform where things were going wrong. She asked me to give you this. I read enough of it coming over to spare you some of it, if you would rather hear plain than dressed up. Wes looked at the unopened envelope in his hand for a long time. Is plain plain? She isn't coming. She got as far as looking at Wyoming through a train window and determined Wyoming was considerably more Wyoming than she had accounted for. She is sorry. I believe she means it. She is not a bad woman. She simply is not the right woman for this particular piece of ground. And she arrived at that conclusion about 400 miles past the point where she could have said so gracefully in writing. So she said it through me instead. The thing that crossed Wes Harlan's face then was not grief and not relief either. It landed somewhere honest between the two, in the territory that belongs to a man who has been expecting a blow and finds when it arrives that the expecting was almost worse than the arrival. I'm obliged to you. He turned the unopened letter once in his hand. Running your own cattle and somebody else's heartbreak in the same week seems like a poor arrangement. It wasn't a good arrangement. Ada glanced back toward the train, which was developing an alarming inclination toward departure. But I wasn't going to let a man stand on a platform with flowers and find out the hard way. Some news ought to come from a person, even if it's the wrong person carrying it. She turned to go. He said the thing that kept her standing on that platform longer than either of them had any reasonable business being there. Miss Voss. He did not say it loudly. Before you leave, I don't suppose you know of any outfit hereabouts in need of an experienced hand for 30 days. I find myself in considerably more trouble than a missing bride. The kind of trouble that someone who rides better than she talks might actually be useful for. Ada stopped. She turned back slowly and looked at him the way she looked at an animal she had not correctly assessed on first inspection. Past the flowers and the brushed coat and the plain disappointment, still settling into the line of his shoulders, something in the shape of his question caught her attention, the way an unfamiliar brand caught a cattle trader's eye. Not alarm, interest. 30 days. For what? For keeping a ranch that won't be mine to keep unless I'm married before my 30th birthday. He said it without apology and without self-pity, which was its own kind of thing, which falls on the 23rd of May, 29 days from this morning. The trouble, once Wes Harlan laid it out over coffee at the Rimrock Hotel, was not romantic at all. It was paper. And paper, as Ada had observed across 6 years of trail contracts and buyer agreements and her father's meticulous ledger columns, was often the meaner enemy. His father, August Harlan, had built Ironback Ranch out of 12,000 acres of strong grass and 2 decades of unmovable stubbornness, and had died the previous autumn leaving a will that every lawyer who read it described, in varying degrees of diplomatic language, as a document written by a proud man determined to manage his son from the far side of death. The ranch would pass whole and unencumbered to Wes, provided Wes was a married man keeping a household by his 30th birthday. Failing that condition, half the ranch transferred to his cousin Claude Renner, who had never in his life pulled a calf or stretched a wire, but who had, for the past 6 months, been in quiet and systematic contact with a land agent for the Union Pacific Railroad. My father thought a wife would settle me. Wes's coffee sat untouched and going cold. Mostly I think he was afraid of exactly what is happening now. Renner wants to sell his half the day the clock runs out. Railroad or cattle syndicate, whoever commits first. And once outside money owns half of Ironback, all of it goes within 2 years. I have watched it happen to 3 ranches in this county. I do not intend for it to happen to a 4th. So you advertised for a wife. Ada turned her cup once in its saucer. Not a judgment, A statement of the sequence. I am not proud of the method. He met her eyes without flinching. I am, however, 29 days from losing the only thing my father ever built, which means pride is a luxury I find myself short on this spring. Ada sat with that and turned the whole shape of it over carefully, the way she turned over a horse before committing, checking legs and teeth and temperament all at once. There was something else in the room, under the will and the deadline and the absent bride. She could not name it precisely yet, but it was there, in the way he had said the only thing my father ever built with a weight that was not just about land. Men who had simply lost a business deal did not carry it quite that way. You're asking a stranger you met 40 minutes ago to marry you. I'm asking a stranger I met 40 minutes ago to help me hold a ranch. He said it without heat, without rush. How that help gets arranged on paper or otherwise is a conversation for later, and only if you're willing to have it. I was engaged to a woman I never met for 6 months and it came to exactly nothing. I am not fool enough to think a wedding fixes anything that isn't already real underneath it. A beat. But I have 29 days and a lawyer doing an indecent job on my cousin's behalf, and I would rather spend those days working with someone honest than waiting on something that has already, through a stranger and a folded letter, told me it doesn't want the life. Ada thought it was possibly the strangest proposition ever made over cooling hotel coffee. She also thought it was, uncomfortably, one of the more honest conversations she had sat inside of, with a man who was not her father. I have a buyer waiting on 40 head. I can give you 2 days while I settle that. 2 days is a start. Something behind his expression shifted, not relief exactly. The thing a man feels when a locked door turns out to have some give in it after all. I have learned to work fast this spring. Ironback Ranch was not what Ada had pictured. She had pictured threadbare. She had pictured the desperation visible from 50 yards in the fencing and the stock condition, and the general state of a property, run by a man who had been reduced to matrimonial advertisements in the back pages of an Eastern paper. That was what the situation suggested, and Ada was a person who read situations the way she read stock, which was accurately and without sentiment. She was wrong. The house was sound, not grand. No one had built for grandeur out here where the wind came at every angle, and ornamentation was a form of asking for trouble. But it was plumb and weathered correctly, and the roof had been re-shingled within the last 2 years. The fencing along the drive was tight and straight. The barn had no daylight visible through the south wall, which was the relevant test for a barn in that country. The herd, what she could see of it from the drive, was in excellent condition, fat on spring grass, moving the way cattle moved when they had been properly tended through the winter and had come through clean. Walt Briggs was the man who met them at the barn, 52 years old. Built like something that had been weathered rather than worn, with a gray beard, kept shorter than was fashionable, and eyes that assessed everything in the same level, unhurried way. He had ridden for August Harlan for 11 years. He looked at Ada the way he would have looked at any new element introduced into an operation he was responsible for. Not hostile, not welcoming, simply waiting for data. The other 3 hands took their cue from Walt. They were polite with the precision of men who had not decided yet and were not going to decide prematurely. Ada understood this. It was the same economy she would have applied herself. She did not try to win them. That was the thing about genuine competence. It did not try. It simply did what it did, and either the observation aligned with the evidence or it didn't. Wes came through the barn door behind her, and the same thing happened that had happened every time he moved through a space that was not specifically built with him in mind. He came through with his hat off and his head angled slightly, and the particular careful economy of a very large man who had learned early that door frames were suggestions other people built for themselves. The 3 younger hands straightened incrementally, not from respect exactly, or not only from respect. From the kind of instinctive adjustment a body made in the presence of something that occupied space in a different proportion than expected. Ada filed this away without comment. She was building a picture of this operation, the way she built a picture of any outfit she was working with temporarily, identifying where the inefficiencies lived, and where the strength was and what the stock needed that it wasn't getting. By mid-morning she had identified 3 things. The weaning schedule was 2 weeks behind where it should be for the season. One of the pasture rotations needed adjusting before the south grass got hammered past recovery, and a heifer in the east pen had a left foreleg that was wrong in the way a leg was wrong. when it had been stressed and not caught early enough. She did not say any of this. She watched, she catalogued. She waited for the afternoon when the evidence would arrange itself one way or another. Late afternoon, the heifer got worse. She went down in a section of soft ground near the east fence, not a bog exactly, but enough give that once she was down, she could not get up without making it worse. Walt went for the rope first, got it on her cleanly. Good loop, right angle. She lunged. The ground gave. Walt's horse slipped back, and the angle went wrong, and the heifer got more tangled, not less. Ada did not say anything. She moved her horse wide left, building a loop in her own rope while she was still moving, and she dropped it exactly where it needed to go on the second try, and held her angle while Walt repositioned. Between the two ropes, working without a word exchanged because the work did not require words, they got the heifer out of the soft ground and onto stable footing. Then Ada dismounted and checked the leg. She had seen this particular injury before, this specific presentation of it, the way the joint tracked wrong at the walk, and the heat distribution along the cannon bone told her what she needed to know and told her quickly. She said it the way her father had taught her, with what was available, done correctly, without rushing the parts that could not be rushed. When she stood up, the heifer was bearing weight in a way she had not been 20 minutes earlier. Walt watched all of this without comment. He had the quality of a man who spent his commentary carefully because he had observed that most things worth saying eventually said themselves if you waited long enough. That evening at supper, the hands stopped calling Ada ma'am with the careful edges on it. They started calling her ma'am the way you said it to someone who had earned the word. The difference was not in the word. It was in the angle of the thing. 2 days became 4. 4 became a week. The weaning schedule, the pasture rotation, the cataloging of the herd's winter losses and spring additions that needed to be reconciled against the ledger, Wes kept in the front room. There was genuine work to do, and Ada found herself doing it, not because the arrangement demanded it, but because the work was there, and she was the person available for it. And she had never in her life been able to leave work undone that she could see needed doing. The 30-day arrangement had begun to feel less like charity, and more like a thing that neither of them had named aloud yet, but that both of them could see taking shape in the work and the evenings on the porch, with the lawyer's correspondence spread between them and the will's exact language, examined the way you examined a contract you were trying to find the weakness in. They worked the problem like two people solving a puzzle together, not like two people falling into anything, which was, Ada noted to herself, probably the safest way for the whole situation to be proceeding. She caught him watching her sometimes, when she was working, when she was reading. Once when she came in from the south fence at dusk with mud on her boots and the last light doing something complicated with the Wyoming sky behind her. He looked away each time before she could name what the expression was. Not quite surprise. Something older than surprise. The way a man looked at something he almost recognized but could not place. She did not ask about it. There were things in this house she had not been told, and she had been on enough ranches long enough to understand that some of those things would come clear in time, and some of them were not hers to know. She paid attention instead, which was a different thing and more useful. On the morning of the 9th day, before any of what was waiting had arrived, Claude Renner rode out to see what his cousin was up to. He came in from the north, which meant he had taken the long way, and the long way meant he had seen the state of the fencing along the perimeter before he reached the yard, which meant he already knew the place was not falling apart the way it was supposed to be falling apart. He did not hurry. Claude Renner did things at the pace of a man who believed time was on his side. He wore a clean vest and a hat that had not seen trail dust in recent memory, and the expression of a man who had filed paperwork and was comfortable letting the paperwork do the work. He did not dismount. He looked at Ada the way he looked at the fencing, measuring, identifying obstacles. Word in town is your bride never arrived. He spoke to Wes but kept his eyes on Ada, and that whoever this woman is, she was collected off a stock train for the occasion. A judge is going to want to know this marriage is genuine, cousin, not paper dressed up to beat a deadline. I intend to make certain, he asks. Wes started to answer. Ada was faster. Ask away, Mr. Renner. She said it at a conversational volume, which was somehow the more effective register. I have put more of this outfit's brands on calves in 9 days than you have put on anything in your life. You go ahead and tell your judge that a woman who can rope and doctor and balance a ranch ledger is not a genuine wife because she came in on a stock car instead of a passenger coach. I expect he will have some opinions about which one of you has any idea what a working marriage in this country actually looks like. Claude Renner had no immediate answer for that. He turned his horse and rode back the way he had come, which was north, which was the long way again. The yard was quiet for a moment after the dust started settling. You didn't have to fight that battle. Wes was watching the place where the dust rose and spread and thinned. It was mine to carry. And Ada heard herself say, "It's ours." She did not walk it back. Because she had meant it, and because she was not a woman who walked back things she had meant. But she noted it. Noted the word and noted the ease with which it had come, and noted that neither of them made a production of it, and both of them noticed it. The word sat in the air of the ironback yard in the April light, like something that had been waiting to be said and had simply found its moment. On the 21st evening, the lamp on the porch burned steady with no wind to threaten it. Ada sat in the chair to the left of the door, with a saddle blanket across her knees and a needle working through the near edge, where the stitching had given way across 4 inches of stress point. The kind of failure that started small and went large fast if it wasn't caught, and she had caught it. She was repairing it the way her mother had taught her. Not a standard running stitch. Her mother's own pattern. A small angled stitch repeated in sequence that produced, if you looked at it right, a row of shapes like small birds running in a line. Her mother had said once that a plain patch was an insult to good canvas. So she made the repair something worth looking at. Ada stitched without thinking about the stitch. That was the point of knowing something well enough. Your hands did what they knew and your mind went elsewhere. Wes sat in the other chair with the lawyer's correspondence on his knee, not reading it. She was aware of him the way you became aware of a room's particular quality of stillness, and then the quality of the stillness changed. She looked up. He was looking at her hands, not at her, at the needle, at the canvas, at the small red shapes accumulating in patient sequence across the repair, each one identical to the one before it in the way that only long practice made a mark identical. He had gone very still. The kind of still that was not restful. Where did you learn that stitch? Not a question the way questions usually sounded. Quieter than a question. More internal. My mother. Ada turned the blanket to check her tension without breaking the rhythm of the work. She used it on everything. Said it took the same time as a plain patch and looked like it was worth the time. I have never stitched anything else. The silence that followed had a different texture than the silence before it. Show me the shoulder. Ada looked up then. His face had done something she had not seen it do before. Not the ordinary collection of expressions she had catalogued over 3 weeks. The focus, the dry amusement, the weight she had identified on the first morning at the hotel, and had tracked across the days without ever being able to name it fully. This was different. This was a man looking at something that should not be in front of him, and trying to determine whether what he was seeing was actually what he was seeing. Wes. She kept her voice even. What is it? He set the papers on the porch rail. He looked at his hands for a moment, the way a man looked at his hands when he was deciding how to say something that had never been said. Winter of 1876. Each word placed with care. A push along the Platte River corridor. Late season. Whiteout came in fast, rider separated from his outfit. On the ground long enough for it to matter. A pause long enough to have weight. Does that account mean something to you? Ada's hands went still on the needle. Because she remembered. Not clearly. 3 years was 3 years and the night had been a bad one, and she had been moving the whole time, which was how you survived in a whiteout. You stayed moving. But she remembered the sound of breathing in the white. The particular sound of a man's breathing when the cold had already done most of its work. The fire that took 3 attempts because the wind wanted it more than she did. The coat she had put around him before the fire was going, because she had her own warmth and he did not, and she had cattle scattered in 4 directions and a job that was not finished. There was a rider. Her voice had changed registers. On the ground, half frozen. I found him by sound. I never asked his name and I left before I needed it. She looked at him across the porch, across the lamplight, across 3 winters. I left my coat because he needed it more than I did, and I had cattle to find. Wes Harlan sat very still in the porch chair that was slightly too small for him, and looked at Ada Voss across the lamp between them. "The coat is in a trunk in this house." He said it as though saying it helped him determine whether it was true. "It has been in that trunk since the morning I came back to the line shack and found it. I could not give it away. I tried once and could not." The silence that came after that had weight and shape and dimensions. "My mother stitched that coat." Ada said it quietly. "The same pattern. I know that pattern. I have known it my whole life, and I have put it into everything I have ever repaired. And I did not think about it when I made that fire, and put the coat around a man who was half dead in a drift, because it was cold and it was there, and I had work to finish." Neither of them said anything for a long time after that, because the thing that needed saying did not quite have a form yet. It was too large for the forms that words came in. A man who spent 3 years carrying a coat that belonged to a woman he could never find, and the woman who had left it there was sitting across from him with a needle in her hand, and the same stitch in the canvas, and 3 years of not knowing finally collapsed into the present tense in the space of one lamplit porch on a Wyoming evening. "You kept me alive." The words came out of him differently from the others. "And you never knew my name. And 3 years later you were the first person to tell me I bought the wrong bride." Something moved across his face that was not quite a laugh but shared a border with one. "Ada Voss, I don't think you have ever in your life been the wrong anything." She looked at him across the lamplight. She looked at the canvas in her hands. She looked at the small red birds running in their patient row. There was a hearing in 3 days. There was a trunk in the back bedroom with a coat in it that she had worn on a storm-dark trail in 1876 and never expected to see again. There was a man across from her who had carried that coat for 3 winters without knowing whose it was. And she was whose it was. That was the kind of fact that landed differently from other facts. Not loudly, not with drama, the way a key landed when it found the right lock. A small sound and a large consequence. She did not say what she was thinking, because what she was thinking was still becoming something, and she did not speak things that had not yet finished becoming themselves. She folded it into the place where the important things went when they were not ready to be words. "We should talk about the hearing." She picked up the needle. "We should," he agreed. Neither of them moved to get the papers. The lamp burned the way a fire burned when there was good wood in it and no wind, steady, clean, with no apparent intention of going out any time soon. Wyoming went on in every direction outside the circle of the porch light, enormous and indifferent, and extraordinarily present in the dark. And Ada Voss sat on a porch that was not hers yet and felt something she did not have a precise name for. Not ownership. That was not it, and she was honest enough to know it. Something more like recognition. The same feeling she got sometimes on a trail late in a drive, when the terrain started to look like country she had been in before. Not because she had been there, but because it was the kind of country that suited her particular shape without her having been the one to choose it. She picked up the needle. She finished the stitch. The small red birds ran their patient line across the repaired edge of the canvas, and the lamp held its ground against the dark. And the hearing was in 3 days, and Claude Renner was already in the county seat, with his filing and his witnesses and his careful arrangement of facts turned sideways. And in the back bedroom, in a trunk at the foot of an old bedstead, a coat waited with its shoulders stitched in a patanan that had survived a blizzard and 3 winters in a box and was about to survive something else entirely. Word count 4,103. Wait, I need to continue to reach the 6,000 minimum. Let me complete the full part 1 now. Ada did not sleep badly that night. She slept the way you slept, when your mind had done the work it needed to do, and had set the results on the table and was waiting for morning to act on them. What the mind had worked through was considerable, and she knew better than to fight the working of it. You let the working happen. You stayed out of its way. You woke up on the other side with something you could use. She was dressed and out, before Walt Briggs reached the barn, which had become its own kind of statement over the past 3 weeks. Not performed. Simply true, the way most things she did were simply true. The East Penn animals were quiet in the gray before full light. She checked the heifer's foreleg first, the way she checked anything she had put work into, not because she doubted the work, but because checking was how you knew whether the work had held. The leg was better. The heat had come down overnight and the joint was tracking cleaner at the walk. She stood with one hand on the animal's neck and felt the steadiness under her palm, and noted it the same way she noted everything, without comment for her own records. Walt came in from the far side with his lantern and went directly to the grain situation at the north wall without looking in her direction, which was how she knew he had something on his mind that he had not yet decided to say. She waited. Walt Briggs was not a man you hurried. He would arrive at the thing in his own time, or he would not arrive at it at all. And pushing him one way or the other only confirmed that you did not understand how he worked, which was information you could not afford to give him. He finished with the grain. He checked the water. He stood for a moment with his hands on the top rail of the near pen, and looked at nothing in particular. And then he looked at the heifer's foreleg, and then he looked at Ada. That leg's holding better than I expected. It will need another week before she's on full rotation. Ada kept her eyes on the animal. The joint's still compensating. You'll see it in how she stands when she's tired. Walt was quiet for long enough that it stopped being the pause before speech and started being something else. Claude Renner was in town yesterday. He said it the way he said most things, level and without inflection, letting the fact carry its own weight, talking to people at the feed store. Ada adjusted her angle slightly so she could watch his face without appearing to watch his face, which was a skill that came from years of reading livestock and had applications she had not initially anticipated. Which people? Harmon at the counter, the Becca brothers. Anyone who'd listen, by the account I got. A beat. Saying the Judge Renner brought up from Cheyenne has a reputation for ruling on the letter of conditions, not the spirit. Ada turned that over. A judge brought up from Cheyenne on special arrangement cost real money, which told you something about how seriously Claude Renner was playing this. A judge with a reputation for the letter of conditions rather than the spirit was a judge who would look at the facts of how this had started and weigh them heavily against whatever had developed after. What does Wes know? What I just told you, told him last night. Walt finally looked directly at her, the look that had been building since she arrived and had now arrived at whatever it was going to be. I want to say something and then I'm not going to say it again. She waited. I worked for August Harlan for 11 years. His voice stayed level, accurate rather than warm or cold. I know what he built and I know what he was afraid of when he wrote that will the way he wrote it. He wasn't wrong to be afraid. What I've watched in this yard for 3 weeks is not a woman serving out a contract. He paused, not for effect, for precision. I've watched a woman who understands what a ranch is for. Those are not the same thing, and I know the difference. And I am prepared to say so to anyone who asks, including a judge from Cheyenne. Ada looked at him. I appreciate that, Mr. Briggs. I'm not doing it for you. The corner of his mouth moved in a way that was not quite a smile but was adjacent to one. I'm doing it because August would have done it. And I've been riding for this outfit long enough that his opinions have become a habit I can't break. He picked up his lantern and walked out. Ada stood alone in the barn for a moment with the horses breathing around her, and the cold coming through the boards in thin gray seams, and the heifer standing better than she had been standing the day before. Then she went to the house. Wes was at the kitchen table with the hearing documents open and a cup of coffee going cold beside them. He looked like a man who had read the same pages enough times to have committed them to memory and was reading them again in case they said something different this time, which was the kind of reading you did when you had run out of other options. Walt told me about the feed store. Ada pulled out the chair across from him and sat down. Falk is thorough. Wes turned the top page over so the text faced the table. Renner hired well, I'll give him that. He looked up. Garrett says our strongest argument is the totality of circumstances. The work you've done here, the genuine nature of the arrangement as it developed, a beat. He doesn't know about the coat. The silence that followed was not the same silence as all the other silences they had built in this kitchen over 3 weeks. This one had an edge. Wes. She kept her voice level. If you don't tell it, Renner's version is the only version Judge has that explains why a woman stepped off a livestock car and ended up at Ironback Ranch before the week was out. He stood and went to the window. He was the kind of man whose stillness at a window was not nothing, because when he stood somewhere, the space organized itself around the fact of him, and the window with the ranch yard behind it, and the morning light coming across the grass framed him the way a window framed anything it was large enough to hold. She watched him stand there and understood something she had not understood fully before that moment. Telling the story of that night in a public courtroom was not a tactical decision for him in the way it was for her. It was the private thing made common property. The thing he had folded away and carried for 3 years, taken out and handed to 60 strangers and a circuit judge and a court record that would exist in Cheyenne for the rest of both their lives. She thought about what Walt had said, about what she had seen in the way Wes moved through the south-facing rooms of this house, as though navigating around something not quite visible. She did not know yet what that was. She had identified its presence in the weight of him, in the particular quality of how he said the only thing my father ever built, in the way certain parts of the property seemed to require a different kind of attention from him than others. She had not asked. Some things came clear in their own time. But she understood the coat. She understood that he had kept it for 3 years, not because he expected to find the answer, but because putting it away entirely would have meant accepting that the night had no resolution. And a man who could not resolve a thing found other ways to carry it. The coat was the proof that something had happened to him, and that a person had been there, and that the person had been real. Without the coat, there was only the memory of the dark and the cold, and a voice he could not attach to a face, and that was a harder thing to carry than canvas and red thread. She thought about that for a moment, about what it meant to carry a thing that way, about the particular stubbornness of keeping something you could not give away, and could not use and could not explain to anyone in a way that made sense from the outside. The coat, she said carefully, was my mother's stitching, not mine. I wore it because it was cold and it was there. But she made it, and she put that stitch into it, and every piece of canvas she ever repaired has that same pattern because she said a plain patch was an insult to good work. I have been putting that stitch into things since I was 12 years old without thinking about it. She held his gaze when he turned from the window. The coat belongs to that. Not to a courtroom, but the fact of it. The fact that you kept it and I left it, and 3 years later we are standing in this kitchen. That fact belongs in that room tomorrow. Wes was quiet for a long time. He came back to the table and sat down and looked at his coffee, and then looked at the documents, and then looked at his hands. His hands on the table were very large and very still. Ruth would have said the same thing. He said it low, not performing anything, just placing it accurately. She had no patience with men who protected their own feelings at the cost of the practical thing that needed doing. It was the first time he had said that name to Ada directly. Not Ruth as an abstraction. Not the sense of something present in the house that she had been navigating around for 3 weeks without knowing its shape. Ruth as a person who had said things and thought things and had an opinion about men who protected their own feelings. Ada said nothing because nothing was the right answer. Some information was complete in itself and needed only to be received. She received it and let it sit between them on the table, without trying to do anything with it, because the moment it needed something done with it, she would do something. But it did not need that yet. After a while he said, "I'll tell it." She nodded once. That was enough. Outside the kitchen window, the morning had come fully up over the eastern ridge, the light going from gray to the particular clear yellow of a Wyoming spring morning that made the grass look like something worth fighting for. And the hearing was in 3 days. And Claude Renner was already in the county seat with his filing and his lawyer and his careful arrangement of facts that were all true and none of them the truth. And in the back bedroom, in a trunk at the foot of an old bedstead, a coat waited with its small red birds running patient and unchanged across the left shoulder, having survived a blizzard and 3 years in a box and a night neither of them had planned for, ready now for whatever it was going to have to survive next. Walt Briggs had been riding for August Harlan since before Wes was old enough to know what 11 years meant, and in those 11 years he had developed the opinion, never stated directly because Walt did not state opinions directly, that the 2 most dangerous things on the Ironback spread were a drifted fence line in March and a Harlan man who had decided something without telling anyone what he had decided. Wes Harlan had decided something. Walt could see it in the way he moved through the kitchen the morning after the porch conversation, not avoiding the center of the room, but navigating it differently than he had the day before. The way a man navigated space when the internal map had shifted and the furniture had not yet caught up. He poured his coffee. He drank it standing at the window looking east. He set the cup down with more deliberateness than the act required. Walt noted all of this and said nothing about any of it, and went out to check the north waterline before the day got away from him. Ada was already at the east pen when the light came fully up, which meant she had been there before the light came fully up, which had become its own kind of baseline over the past 12 days. The heifer she had worked on was standing well, weight distributed evenly. The overcautious three-legged stance of the day before had resolved overnight into something closer to normal. Ada stood at the rail with her arms crossed, and her hat pulled against the angle of the early sun, and looked at the animal with the expression of someone running a quiet calculation and arriving at a number she could work with. Walt came around the end of the pen. "She'll do. Another week before she's on full rotation." Ada did not look away from the heifer. "The left cannon is still compensating when she's tired. You'll see it after the evening feed." Walt leaned on the rail beside her, and they stood for a moment, watching the animal move, which was the comfortable silence of two people who had learned to read the same things and were reading them at the same time without needing to narrate the process. August Harlan raised good stock. Walt said it not as a compliment but as a statement of condition, the way you stated the moisture content of good grass. Man knew cattle the way some men know weather, in the blood and in the bone, and not available for argument. Ada took this in. Walt Briggs did not talk about August Harlan for no reason. Wes runs it the same way. Better, in some respects. Walt straightened and moved toward the grain situation at the back of the pen, the work resuming because the work did not pause for conversation. August was stubborn in straight lines. Wes is stubborn, but he curves around things when he needs to. Takes longer to move him, but once he's moved, he stays moved a beat. Ruth understood that, knew how to let him find the thing himself instead of pointing at it. The name landed in the air between them with the weight of something that had been present the whole time, and had simply been waiting for a surface to land on. Ada kept her face toward the heifer. How long ago? 3 years in April. Walt's voice stayed level because level was the only register he trusted for things this size. She went out alone to check the far side of the south crossing after a heavy spring runoff. Creek was running high and fast. The horse came back, a pause that was doing considerable work. Wes was out on the north line fixing a section that had gone down in the mud. He rode out when he saw the horse come in alone. Ada did not say anything. She was building the picture the way you built any picture you needed to understand, adding detail to detail until the shape became clear. The south crossing, the April creek, the south pasture that Wes did not ride through in April by choice. The weight she had identified in him on that first morning at the hotel and had tracked across 12 days without being able to name it completely. It had a name now. "He carries both things," Ada said quietly, not a question, a piece of the picture being placed. Walt looked at her for a moment with the expression of a man recalibrating an estimate. Both things, Ruth, and not knowing who found him in the snow. Walt was quiet for 3 full seconds. Figured that out. Last night. Another 3 seconds. Good. He picked up the grain bucket and moved to the far end of the pen and did not say anything else about it, which was exactly what Ada had expected and exactly what she needed. Some information became more useful when it was simply received and not discussed further. She went back to the house to begin on the ledger reconciliation she had been working through since the day before, and she carried both pieces of information with her and put them where they needed to go. Wes found her at the writing desk in the front room 2 hours later. The ledger open and the previous 3 seasons of Herd records stacked to the left in the order she had organized them. Oldest to newest, because you tracked a thing forward from where it started if you wanted to understand where it currently was. He stood in the doorway with his hat in his hand, which was the posture he took when he was considering saying something he had not finished deciding about yet. She kept working. Let him arrive at it. "Garrett wants to meet this afternoon." He turned his hat once by the brim, a slow revolution. "He has reviewed the filing Renner submitted and he has thoughts." What kind of thoughts? The kind that cost money and take time and may or may not accomplish anything before the 23rd. He looked at the ledger stack. He thinks the totality argument is solid, but he is concerned about the origin circumstances. The station agent's testimony will establish clearly that Ida Holt did not leave the train. The hotel clerk will establish that you checked in under your own name the same afternoon. Renner has arranged both of those facts to suggest a particular sequence. A convenient sequence. A sequence that a judge ruling on the letter of conditions rather than the spirit of them might find persuasive. He finally came into the room and sat in the chair near the window, the chair that was slightly too upright for a man his size, but which he had adapted to over enough years that the adaptation had become its own kind of fit. Facts arranged cleverly beat facts arranged honestly about half the time. In Garrett's experience, Ada set down her pen, and the other half. Wes looked at her steadily. The other half. The honest arrangement wins because someone in the room can see past the arrangement to the thing underneath it. She thought about her father's equipment table before a long drive. Everything laid out in the order it would be needed. No commentary, no argument. Just the honest shape of what was required and what was available, visible to anyone who knew how to look at it. Tell Garrett we will be there at 3. The letter from her father arrived while she was at the water trough, checking the condition of the North herd's feet for signs of the soft ground trouble that had been working through the county since the wet spring. The ranch hand who brought it out from town left it on the porch rail weighted under a stone, which was how her father's letters usually arrived when she was in the field, because he had been sending her letters to ranches for 6 years and had long since learned that she was rarely at the house when the mail came. George Voss wrote the way he did everything, economically. Not a word present that was not carrying its full weight. Ada read it leaning against the fence rail, with the afternoon light coming at a low angle across the grass, the herd moving in the middle distance with the unhurried purpose of animals that had been well managed through a hard winter and had come out the other side with reserves intact. The cattle had sold well. 40 head, good weight, fair price. He mentioned this first because he understood that business settled before sentiment meant sentiment went down easier. And also because he was a man who believed that the practical foundation of a thing determined whether the rest of it could stand. Then, in the same unhurried hand he used for branding schedules and supply lists, Jed Carver had been by the house twice in the past month asking after her. Ran a sound operation 2 counties west, 6 years in the same location, which was the relevant measure if you knew what you were looking at. Good water rights. No debt he knew of. Crew that came back season to season, which said more about a man's outfit than most of what the man said himself. A person who came by twice in 1 month while a woman was 400 miles north, her father wrote, was a person who deserved a serious answer one way or another. He did not say what answer. He never did. He laid the facts and let whoever was reading decide what to do with them. Ada read the letter twice, then a third time, which told her something about the state of her own thinking that she did not particularly want to examine in the middle of a pasture with the afternoon running thin. She folded the letter into her vest pocket and went back to checking feet. She thought about Jed Carver, whom she knew by reputation, and had spoken with twice at livestock auctions over the past 3 years. A solid man. The kind of man whose name came up in conversation and nobody had anything to say against it, which was rarer than people gave credit. The kind of man who ran a good operation quietly and did not require applause for the running of it. She thought about what a serious answer would look like. What she would be saying yes or no to. She thought about the porch the night before, and the lamplight and the needle in her hand, and the way Wes Harlan had gone very still looking at the stitch her mother had taught her. She thought about the coat in the trunk. Then she went back to checking feet, because there were 12 heads still to go through, and the light was not going to hold indefinitely. That evening she found pen and paper at the writing desk in the front room after supper, when Wes had gone out to check the South Water situation, and the hands were settled in the bunkhouse, and the house was quiet in the particular way of a working ranch house at night, which was not the quiet of emptiness, but the quiet of things at rest that would begin again before daylight. 2 drafts torn and dropped in the wastebasket. The wastebasket by that desk had never held anything more expensive than that. The 3rd draft stood. She told her father the truth, because she had tried alternatives across various situations over the years, and they never held. And he always knew anyway. She told him about the wrong bride and the 30 days, and a rancher who had offered honest work over a decorated promise. She told him Ironback Ranch was not what she had expected, and that it grew more worth fighting for with every morning she rode fence on it, which surprised her, and she was not a woman who surprised easily. She told him Jed Carver was a good man, solid, the kind of man whose name came up clean in every conversation, and that she was not in a position to promise him anything, because she did not yet know what she was promising herself. Near the bottom of the page she wrote, "You always said a person ought to choose the harder true thing over the easier maybe. I do not know yet whether this is the true thing. I know it is not the easy one, and for the first time in my life, that is not what is pushing me off it." She sealed the envelope and left it on the rail to go in with the next morning's town run. Wes came in from the South water check while she was still at the desk. He saw the envelope on the rail and did not ask about it, which was another thing she noted about him. The things he did not ask about, and the things he did, and what the distinction revealed about the shape of his understanding. Garrett at 3 tomorrow still holds. He hung his hat on the peg near the door. He found a precedent from a circuit ruling out of Denver in '74 that may support the totality argument. A marriage of circumstance that developed genuine foundation over time was held to satisfy the spirit of a conditional inheritance. Was the condition worded similarly? Close enough to argue. He moved to the kitchen for water, and she heard the sound of the pump handle and the pour of it into a cup. The ordinary sounds of an ordinary evening, on an ordinary working ranch that was not ordinary in any of the ways that mattered. Garrett thinks, if we can establish the timeline of the work you've done here, the progression of the arrangement from a practical agreement to something more substantive, we have ground to stand on. Ada turned in her chair to face the doorway. He still does not know about the coat. The sound of the water cup being set down. A pause. Wes came back to the doorway with the cup in his hand and leaned his shoulder against the frame, which was the posture he took when he was not going to move until he had finished the thing he had started. No, it changes the weight of what you tell him. I know that. It also changes what you tell the court. He looked at her for a long moment. Outside, something moved in the dark beyond the window, one of the horses shifting in the near pasture, and the sound of it was familiar and settling in the way of sounds that belonged to a place you had been long enough to know its rhythms. Telling it in a courtroom is a different thing than telling it on a porch. His voice was even, but it had something underneath the evenness. The way deep water was even on the surface and doing something else entirely below. A porch is private. A courtroom is a record. Everything said in there becomes something anyone can read in Cheyenne for the rest of time. Ada understood this. She had not considered it from precisely that angle before this moment, and considering it from that angle now, she understood it more fully than she had expected to. "Ruth," she said quietly, placing the name carefully on the table between them, not using it to get somewhere, just naming what was actually present in the room. The word did something to his face that she watched happen and did not look away from. "Ruth would have told me to tell it." He said it without any decoration. Just set it down accurately where it belonged. She had no patience for men who protected their feelings at the cost of the practical thing that needed doing. She would have sat down across from me at this table and told me exactly what the situation required, and then waited with the specific quality of patience she had for when she already knew she was right and was allowing me time to arrive at the same place. Ada said nothing. Because nothing was correct. Because some things were complete in themselves and needed a person to simply be present with them, rather than to respond to them. After a while Wes looked at the cup in his hand and then at the window and then at her. "I will tell Garrett about the coat tomorrow." "All right, and I will tell the court." "All right," he nodded once. The small decisive nod of a man who has arrived at a thing and is not going to unarrive at it, and went to the kitchen to put the cup down, and then went upstairs. And Ada sat in the front room for a while longer in the lamplight, with the ledger open on the desk, and the third draft of the letter to her father already sealed on the rail. She was not, she recognized, a woman who knew her own interior landscape as well as she knew other kinds of terrain. She could read a pasture at 40 yards and tell you what it needed and what it had too much of and what it would look like in 6 months if you managed it right or wrong. She could read a horse in the first 30 seconds of watching it move. She could read a man's cattle operation and know within 2 hours whether the man who ran it was worth trusting on a handshake. She could not, at this particular moment, read herself with anything like that precision. What she could say was this: she had come to Rimrock Station to move 40 head of commercial beef and had intended to be gone before the week was out, and she was here. 12 days into an arrangement that had started as something practical and sequential, and had become somewhere along the way something she could not describe as only practical, and the fact of not being able to describe it otherwise was itself information. Even if she did not yet know what to do with it, she blew out the lamp and went to bed and thought about the coat in the trunk in the room at the end of the hall. 3 years of careful keeping, and what it meant that the person it belonged to had been 12 days away the entire time, and neither of them had known. Claude Renner made his next move 4 days before the hearing, and he made it quietly and from a direction no one had been watching. He came into town on a Tuesday and did not go near Ironback Ranch, and did not seek out Wes Harlan or his lawyer, and did not make any public demonstration of his intentions. He went to Harmon's feed store at the north end of the main road, where the locals who worked cattle operations gathered on Tuesday mornings to settle accounts and discuss the condition of the spring grass and argue in a good-natured way about the price of grain, and he spent 45 minutes talking to people in the manner of a man who had nothing particular to say and was simply catching up. Walt Briggs was there settling the monthly grain account. Renner did not approach Walt directly. He approached the conversation around Walt, which was more sophisticated and considerably more dangerous. He talked about the spring season. He talked about the condition of the grass along the creek bottoms. He made a comment about a neighboring outfit that had changed hands the previous autumn, Annis Tees, and expressed what appeared to be genuine concern about whether the new management had enough experience for the challenges of a Wyoming operation. And then, in the same conversational tone, he said something to Harmon at the counter about how he hoped whatever happened with Ironback sorted itself out in a way that was good for Wes, because Wes was a decent man who deserved to make his own choices rather than having choices made for him by the pressure of a deadline and a woman who had shown up at the right moment. Walt finished his business at the counter and left without responding to anything Renner had said, because that was how Walt handled things he needed to think about before he could trust his response to them. He rode back to Ironback with the grain settled and a particular kind of quiet in him that had nothing to do with contentment. He did not tell Ada about the conversation that day. He moved through the afternoon work with the thoroughness he brought to everything, and he did not say anything that was not required by the work, and he thought about what Renner had said and what Renner had intended by it and the difference between those two things. Because Claude Renner had not said anything false. That was the precise difficulty. Everything he had said was technically available to a reasonable interpretation. He had not accused Ada of anything. He had not made any argument that could be repeated and disputed. He had simply placed a set of suggestions in the air of a room where Walt Briggs was present, and the suggestions were designed to press on the exact place where genuine loyalty to Wes intersected with genuine uncertainty about Ada, and the precision of the targeting told you how well Renner understood the people he was working with. Walt came to Ada the next morning. He found her in the barn, which was where she spent the first hour of every morning, working through the harness inventory that had been well maintained but not well documented and needed a full accounting before any serious planning could happen. She was at the far end, with the harness spread across a workbench, making notes in the small book she kept in her vest pocket, cross-referencing the physical condition of each piece with the entries in the tack log she had found in the corner cabinet. He came in from the side door and stood near the wall, doing nothing in particular with a bridle that did not need anything done to it. Ada gave him approximately 2 minutes. Then, Mr. Briggs, if something's changed in how you're thinking about this situation, I would rather hear it straight than watch you find things to fix that don't need fixing. He set the bridle down. He told her about the feed store in the even way he told everything, without editorializing, letting the sequence of events carry whatever weight it carried. Renner, the conversation around rather than at him, the precise language about Wes deserving to make his own choices and not have them made by deadline pressure, and a woman who arrived at the right moment. Ada listened without moving. The harness lay across the workbench, and her notebook was open, and her pen was in her hand, and she did not write anything while Walt was talking. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment that was long enough to be deliberate and short enough not to be dramatic. He is good at that. Not anger in her voice, something colder and more precise. Finding the true thing and putting it where it will do the most damage. The true thing being that I did arrive at the right moment. He just left out what right moment means and let the room fill in the rest. Walt looked at her. Mr. Briggs. She set the pen down and faced him squarely, the full weight of her attention, which was not a small thing. You have worked this land for 11 years. You knew August Harlan before and after his will. You have watched Wes Harlan run this outfit through bad winters and a flooded spring. And the kind of year that separates the operations built on real foundation from the ones built on luck and good timing. She did not raise her voice. Did not need to. You know the difference between someone fighting for a place and someone fighting over it. I am asking you to use that same judgment on what you have actually seen in the past 12 days and decide for yourself, not what Renner suggested you might be seeing, what you saw. The barn was quiet around them. One of the horses shifted in its stall. Light came through the gap at the top of the south wall in a thin, straight line and moved with the dust. Walt looked at her for a long time in the way he looked at things he was making a final determination about. He picked up the bridle, hung it on its proper peg. I will be starting early on the south herd tomorrow. Could use another set of hands if you are up. Ada Voss was up. She was also quietly furious in the particular way of someone who understood that visible fury was a tactical liability, and so kept it entirely internal, where it did what it was going to do, without helping Renner's position or unsettling Walt's fragile recalibration. She rode the south herd the next morning at Walt's side, and did not mention the barn conversation again because the barn conversation had been completed, and the work that came after it was its own argument, more durable than anything either of them could have said. The morning of the day before the hearing, Ada found Wes in the kitchen before she expected him, which meant he had been up before she had, which meant he had been up before 4 because she had been up at 4, and the coffee in the pot was old. He had the filing spread across the table, the documents from Renner's lawyer, organized into 3 separate stacks by some sorting principle she could not immediately identify. His hands were flat on the table on either side of the stacks, and he was looking at the middle group of documents with the expression of a man who has already lost an argument he was still technically making. Falk is thorough. She poured the old coffee out and started fresh because the day was going to require better than what was in the pot. You said that before. He found the hotel clerk's exact register entry. Wes did not look up from the documents, name, date, time of check-in. He will put it in front of the court, and it will be accurate, and it will look like exactly what he intends it to look like, which is a woman installing herself at the Ironback Ranch under her own name 48 hours after the intended bride failed to appear. The sequence is accurate. The sequence is accurate and the implication is wrong. And a judge ruling on the letter of conditions in a will is going to weigh the accurate sequence heavily. He finally looked up. Garrett thinks the precedent from Denver is useful but not decisive. He thinks the totality of circumstances argument requires something more than documented work performance. It requires the court to understand why a woman who had no connection to Rimrock Station and no stake in Ironback Ranch would be standing on that platform delivering a stranger's bad news when she had 40 head of commercial beef drawing down her margin in the stock pens. Ada set the fresh coffee pot on the stove and turned to face him. And that requires telling the court about the coat. It requires telling the court about the coat. The kitchen was quiet, in the way of early morning kitchens, the house still holding the night's coolness against the warmth the stove was beginning to build. Through the window the sky was starting to show the first gray distinction between itself and the ridgeline. Not light yet, just the cessation of dark. Wes. She came and sat down across from him. Not at the far end of the table but at the corner nearest him. Close enough that the conversation did not have to travel. What you carry about that night. The not knowing. The coat in the trunk. She looked at him steadily. You have been carrying 2 things for 3 years. Ruth and the woman who was there afterward. Those are not the same weight but they are both real weight. And you have been carrying them the only way you could carry them, which was without putting either one down, because there was nowhere to put them. Something moved in his face, not the ordinary movement of expression, but the deeper movement of a man whose internal architecture was adjusting to something. The court does not need to know about Ruth. Her voice was steady. But it needs to know about the coat. And the coat is how 2 strangers who had no earthly reason to be on the same porch in Wyoming were on the same porch in Wyoming looking at the same stitch. That is not a convenient arrangement. That is not a transaction assembled to beat a deadline. That is the kind of thing that does not have a better explanation than the true one. Wes was quiet for long enough that the stove began to make the sounds of a stove doing what it was designed to do, the small ticking of metal responding to heat. Ruth would have told me to tell it. He said it the second time without the difficulty the first time had carried, as though so saying it once had cleared a passage, that speaking it again could move through more easily. She would have told me I was being a fool for protecting the private thing at the cost of the practical thing, and she would not have been wrong. Ada did not say anything. She let him have the moment of it. Then, tell Garrett this morning before we go in, all of it. Give him the full account so he can prepare for how Falk will respond to it. Wes looked at her across the corner of the table. The light in the kitchen was changing as the sky outside went from first gray to the thin gold that preceded actual sunrise. And in that changing light he looked like what he was, which was a man who had been carrying a considerable amount for a considerable time, and had just arrived at the moment where he could see where to set it down. You found me by the sound of my breathing. His voice was low, not performing anything, placing it accurately, in a whiteout, on a night when the wind was doing everything it could to make sound irrelevant. You found me by the sound of my breathing. Ada thought about that night. She had not thought about it in years, not with any detail, because she had moved on from it the way she moved on from everything, which was forward and without inventory. But she thought about it now, the way the white had direction even when it had no landmarks. The horse circling without its rider. The decision she had made in the space of 3 seconds that did not feel like a decision at all, but simply like the next thing. You were breathing loud. She let the corner of her mouth move slightly. Under the circumstances, I was grateful for it. Something shifted in him at that, a release of some held thing that had been held so long. It had stopped feeling like a held thing, and had started feeling like structure. The hearing was in one day. Claude Renner was in the county seat with his filing and his lawyer, and his careful arrangement of true things turned sideways. And Wes Harlan was going to walk into that courtroom and tell 60 strangers, and a circuit judge the most private thing he had kept for 3 years. And the woman across from him at the kitchen table was the reason the private thing had a shape that could be told. Neither of them said this. They drank their coffee while the morning came up over the ridge, and the horses moved in the near pasture, and the ranch made the sounds it made when it was waking up, which were the sounds of something alive and intact and still worth fighting for. The morning of the hearing arrived, without ceremony. Low clouds sitting on the western ridge, not threatening rain, but suggesting the possibility, in the way of things that had not yet committed. Ada was dressed and in the kitchen before the stove was lit, which meant she had been awake before the stove needed lighting, which was information she did not examine too closely, because she already knew what it meant. What the night had worked through was considerable. Every reason she had come to Rimrock Station was still technically accurate. The cattle had sold. The buyer had paid. The practical sequence of events that had produced the 30-day arrangement was exactly what it had always been, a set of circumstances requiring a response and receiving one. None of that had changed, except that she was here, 12 days past the point where she had planned to be gone, sitting in a kitchen in Wyoming at 5 in the morning, listening to the horses shift in the near pasture, and feeling the particular way a place had begun to account for her presence, the way a good saddle accounted for the weight of the rider, who used it and shaped itself accordingly over time. That was not a practical circumstance. That was something else. And she had been moving alongside it for days without looking at it directly, the way you rode alongside a river in spring flood, aware of it, giving it appropriate distance, not ready to test the crossing. She lit the stove, she made coffee. She stood at the window with the cup in both hands and watched the sky go from black to the gray that preceded color. And she thought about a needle moving through canvas on a porch 3 nights ago, and what it meant that the only person in the world who could have recognized that stitch had been the person sitting 4 feet away from her in the other chair. Not coincidence. She did not have a better word for it yet. But coincidence was not right either, and she knew it. Wes came downstairs at 20 past 5. She heard him before she saw him. The specific sounds of a large man who had learned across many years to move carefully in spaces built for people of ordinary dimensions. Deliberate on the stairs. A slight duck through the kitchen doorway that had become so automatic he no longer thought about it. He was 6 feet 3 inches of Wyoming rancher in the early morning. in his work shirt and vest and boots already laced, and he took up the doorway the way he took up most doorways, which was completely. He came to the counter and poured a cup and stood beside her at the window and looked out at the same grey yard she had been looking at. They drank their coffee. The sky changed slowly toward the color of something useful. After a while he said, "Garrett wants us at 9 to go over the testimony sequence one more time." "All right." He is still concerned about the order. "Context before revelation," he said. "The work documentation first, then the coat." Ada considered this. He is right. A judge hearing the coat account first hears a story. A judge hearing the work first hears evidence, and then the coat gives the evidence its meaning. Wes looked at her over the rim of his cup. "You have thought about this." "I have thought about very little else since 2 in the morning. Something in his face shifted in the direction of what she had catalogued across 3 weeks as the dry amusement, but carrying more weight this morning than the ordinary version. And now I am done thinking about it and ready to go do it." He nodded once, the nod of a man who has arrived somewhere and is not going to unarrive. He set his cup down and went to get his good coat from the peg near the door, the brushed one, the one he had worn the morning on the platform with the flowers. She noticed he did not take the coat from the trunk. That coat was still in the back bedroom, where it had been for 3 years, and where it would remain until the morning decided what the morning was going to be. They rode into Rimrock Station at 8:30. Wes on the big grey that had been his primary horse for 3 years. Ada on the dun that had decided somewhere around day 4 that she was acceptable and had been demonstrating this through increments of cooperation ever since. Walt and the 3 hands followed in the wagon without discussion, because the day had arranged itself and each person knew their part of it without requiring the whole to be explained. Garrett's office was 2 doors south of the courthouse. They spent 40 minutes with him going over the sequence, the precedent from Denver, the specific language of the will's condition, the list of what Falk would likely present and in what order. Garrett was a careful man who had been practicing law in Wyoming long enough to have calibrated his expectations to the territory, which meant he was neither optimistic nor pessimistic, but simply precise. He knew about the coat now. Wes had told him the previous morning. All of it, in the even way he told things he had decided to tell. Garrett had listened them with kindness. Garrett had listened without interrupting, and then sat for a full minute without speaking, and then said that it changed the weight of everything, and that he intended to let Wes tell it directly rather than building it into his own presentation, because a man telling his own story in his own words carried a different authority than a lawyer constructing an argument from that story's materials. The courthouse was a frame building on the north end of the main road, 2 stories, built with more ambition than the town had yet grown to fill, but with the solid foundation of something intended to outlast the intentions that built it. By 9:45, when Ada and Wes arrived after the session with Garrett, 63 of Rimrock Station's 400 residents had taken seats inside, not by announcement, by the specific communication of small communities where significant events sent their own notification through the ordinary movement of people telling people who mentioned it to other people at the counter, at Harmon's and at the post and at the door of Edna Marsh's bakery, where Edna herself had heard it and had decided before 9 o'clock that her husband needed to be present whether he thought so or not. Edna was in the 3rd row with her husband, who wore the expression of a man who had learned through long experience that his wife's instincts about which occasions required his presence were more reliable than his own assessments, and this occasion clearly required it. The Becker brothers, who had been at Harmon's on the morning Claude Renner made his careful suggestions in the vicinity of Walt Briggs, sat near the back on the side of the room that was not the Harlan side. The station agent sat across the room from everyone connected to Ironback Ranch, and looked at the front wall with the fixed attention of a man who had told the truth as he understood it, and was not entirely comfortable with how his truth was being used. Walt Briggs sat in the front row. He had arrived before Wes and Ada, and had positioned himself at the center of the bench with the 3 hands arranged beside him, hats in their laps, in the shirts they reserved for occasions that merited the distinction. They had not been asked to come. They had simply been present when the wagon was leaving the Ironback yard and had gotten in without comment and had ridden into town in the same productive silence they brought to every piece of work they did together. Claude Renner was in the back row. Ada knew this without looking. She could sense the angle of his attention the way you sensed the approach of weather before it reached you, a change in the quality of the air that had not yet named itself. Judge Aldous Crane entered from the side door and the room rose and settled. He was past 60. His face built by decades of riding circuit in conditions that did not accommodate preference, creased deep at the eyes and set at the jaw, with the quality of a man who had spent so many years managing people's attempts to manage him that he had developed an accurate and largely unconscious sense of when it was happening. He brought this quality to the bench without theater and without announcement. It was simply present the way experience was present in a man who had earned it through repetition. Gideon Falk sat at the plaintiff's table with his documents arranged, and his hat beside them, and his professional composure fully in place. He was lean and precise and from Cheyenne, and he had the manner of a man who understood that courtrooms were exercises in controlled persuasion, and had refined his approach to the point where the persuasion was nearly invisible. Falk presented first. He was good in the way that tight fencing was good, each element in its proper place, the whole construction holding without appearing to strain. He laid the chronology without embellishment, because the chronology without embellishment was the argument. The intended bride had not left the passenger car. The woman who appeared on the platform was unknown to his client and unknown to the community. That woman had been established at Ironback Ranch within 48 hours of her arrival. The marriage, if completed before the 23rd, would satisfy the condition in August Harlan's will and prevent the lawful transfer to which his client was otherwise entitled by that same document. He did not use the word fraud. The word was present in the room without being spoken, which was the more effective placement because it could not be objected to. The station agent confirmed that Ida Holt had not disembarked. He gave his testimony in the voice of a man being accurate and careful and not meeting anyone's eyes while he was accurate and careful. The hotel clerk confirmed that Ada had registered under her own name that same afternoon. Both accounts were correct. Both men delivered them with the quality of honesty that knew it was being directed somewhere and did not approve of where. Garrett rose and argued well. Intent established by conduct across time rather than by the circumstances of introduction. Nearly 4 weeks of documented contribution to a working ranch operation, verifiable by any rancher in the county. He cited the Denver precedent. He laid the totality argument with the care of a man who believed in it and was presenting it to a judge he respected. Judge Crane listened and made notes and returned nothing in his expression. Then Wes Harlan stood up without being recognized by the court. He was standing before Garrett had fully registered that he was going to stand, and Garrett made a small movement with one hand that was not quite an objection and not quite a sanction, and then folded both hands on the table and let the thing proceed, because some things in motion could not be redirected without significant cost, and Wes Harlan standing in that courtroom was one of those things. The room felt him stand the way, rooms felt Wes Harlan move through them, not with alarm, with the instinctive attention that large things in motion produced in the bodies of people nearby, the collective adjustment of 63 people, recalibrating to the presence of a man whose shoulders were wider than the chair he had been sitting in, and whose full height in a standing room changed the geometry of the space. Falk began a procedural objection, stopped, because the image of a Cheyenne lawyer telling this particular man, in this particular room, in front of these particular people, that he was not permitted to speak, was an image that would work against every argument Falk had made regardless of the procedural grounds. He set his pen down and waited. Your Honor. Wes held his hat in both hands, the big hand steady. No performance in his voice, no working of the room. The petition describes how this began. I would like to tell the court what it began on top of. Judge Crane looked at him for 3 full seconds with the evaluating attention he brought to everything that passed through his courtroom. Proceed. Wes told it the way he had told it to Ada on the porch 3 nights ago, which was the way you told a thing you had kept for a long time, and had finally decided to release, stripped to its sequence, and spoken plainly without decoration. The late push along the Platte River corridor in November of 1876. The storm that came off the plateau faster than the weather had promised. Visibility gone to the length of an arm in under 20 minutes. The separation from the outfit in the white. His horse recovering from a drifted rut. He did not come with it. the cold moving through sensation into the condition that everyone who worked the Wyoming range understood meant the clock was running in a direction you did not want it running. A woman working drag on a separate outfit heard a riderless horse circling in the white and went looking. Because that was what you did when you heard a riderless horse in those conditions. Because the rider was somewhere and the somewhere could be the end of them. She found him by the sound of his breathing. She built a fire from what she carried in her saddlebag, buffalo chips and dry sage, with hands that had passed through their own first stage of cold. She put her coat around him before the fire was burning properly, because he needed it more than she did in that particular moment, and she kept him talking through the worst hours of the night, with a voice that did not let fear into it, not once, even when his own voice had stopped being reliable. Before first light, she got him onto her horse and walked him 3 miles across ground. The storm had broken to a line shack she knew from prior work on that range. She built a second fire. She left before the light came full because she had cattle scattered across miles of storm-wrecked terrain and a job that was not finished. She did not ask his name and she did not give hers, and she was gone before he was coherent enough to ask. She left the coat. He kept it for 3 years because it was the only evidence the night had happened and the woman had been real, because the stitching at the left shoulder was specific enough that he believed if he searched long enough he would find the person it belonged to. He searched for a year and found nothing. He stopped searching and put the coat in a trunk and kept living, because that was what you did with the things you could not resolve and could not release. 3 years later, on the porch at Ironback Ranch, a woman he had met on a train platform 22 days prior was mending a saddle blanket by lamplight, and the needle in her hand moved through the canvas in a pattern that did not exist anywhere in the world except in one family's hands. Her mother had invented it. Her mother had put it on every piece of canvas she had ever repaired, and she had taught it to her daughter, and the daughter had been putting it into things since she was 12 years old without thinking about it. And the coat in the trunk had that pattern on its left shoulder. And the woman on the porch was the woman who had made the fire. Wes asked the court whether a marriage built on a debt 3 winters deep, on a rescue that had asked nothing in return, sounded to a reasonable person like a transaction assembled to satisfy a calendar condition. The room was quiet in the way rooms became quiet when 60 people stopped doing the small involuntary things that bodies did and simply held still together. Falk had his pen in his hand and was not writing. He was looking at his documents with the expression of a man who understood that the room he was currently in was not the room he had prepared his argument for, and that no adjustment to his prepared argument could reach what Wes Harlan had just placed in front of 63 people, and a circuit judge from Cheyenne. Judge Crane let the silence hold for a moment. He looked at Falk. Falk did not move to speak. Then the judge looked at Ada, Miss Voss. His voice carried the same measured level it had maintained through the entire proceeding. The professional register that gave nothing away and asked for everything. I have one question. I want one answer. Ada stood. The room took her in. Canvas riding skirt with the mended edge at the left knee, the small red birds running their patient line across the repaired stress point, frontier flannel shirt, trail boots with the dust of the Ironback yard still on them. She stood with the stillness of someone who was not performing stillness, but simply was still, because stillness was what the moment was asking for, and she had never been a woman who gave a moment something other than what it asked for. Do you love this man? Separate from the ranch, separate from the deadline, separate from his cousin's ambitions. 63 people. 1 circuit judge. The station agent who had finally stopped looking at the front wall. Walt Briggs in the front row with the hat pressed flat between both palms. Ada Voss did not calculate her answer. Calculation was for things that required it. This did not. I loved the shape of him before I ever learned his name. The ranch is just where I finally caught up to it. The silence that followed was not the silence of people receiving surprising information. It was the silence of people recognizing something they had already understood to be true, and had been waiting to hear said plainly by someone with the honesty to say it. Judge Crane looked at the petition on the bench before him. He looked at it for 10 seconds, which felt longer, in the way that deliberate silences in courtrooms always felt longer than they were. Then he picked it up with the unhurried motion of a man who had made a decision and was enacting it without theater. and he placed it face down to his left. The petition is dismissed. Claude Renner stood up. It was the first unrehearsed thing he had done in the entire proceeding. The careful management of the reasonable aggrieved party, maintained through Falk's presentation and the testimony and Garrett's argument, and Wes's account and Ada's answer, came apart in the moment the judge set the petition down, and what came up in its place was a man who had planned something for 6 months, and had just watched it fail in a courthouse in 40 minutes. He was on his feet and moving toward the bar before he had fully decided what he intended to say, which was exactly the kind of unrehearsed motion that courtrooms were not designed to accommodate. Your Honor. His voice was controlled, but the control was the new kind, the kind applied on top of something that was not controlled. I would ask the court to consider whether the testimony just offered constitutes a verified account or a convenient narrative constructed to satisfy the court's sympathies rather than the legal standard. Judge Crane looked at him. Not a warning look, not a threatening look. The look of a man who had been watching Claude Renner for the better part of an hour, and had formed a complete assessment and was giving him, in this single moment, the opportunity to stop where he was and preserve what remained of his dignity in this room. Renner met the look and held it for 3 seconds. Then he looked at the room. At Walt Briggs in the front row, who was looking back at him with the level attention of 11 years on the same piece of ground. At the Becker brothers near the back, who had come into this room, having already made their determination and whose faces confirmed it. At Edna Marsh in the third row, who was looking at him with an expression that was not hostile but was entirely clear about what it thought of the ground he was standing on. He looked at Ada Voss, who was looking at him with the steady evaluating attention she brought to anything she needed to accurately assess, and who was not, he understood in that moment, a woman who would be moved from where she stood by anything he said in this room or any other. Claude Renner sat down. He did it without speaking another word, which was the only decision available to him that preserved any portion of the ground he had lost. And the room watched him make it, and the watching was its own verdict, the kind that did not require a judge to render, and would not be appealed in any court in Wyoming. Falk gathered his documents with the professional efficiency of a man who had presented the best available case, and had watched it not survive the room. He nodded to Garrett with the impersonal courtesy of opposing counsel, and walked out without looking at anyone in the gallery. Walt Briggs stood when Wes and Ada came through the bar. He came to his feet without announcement, and the 3 hands rose beside him, the way good men move together, without signal, each reading the moment and the others simultaneously and arriving at the same place. They stood with their hats held against their chests and said nothing, because the thing they were communicating did not have a spoken form, and they were not men who reached for approximate words when accurate silence was available. Edna Marsh caught Ada's hand at the door. One firm press, brief and unambiguous, nothing said. She had already said what needed saying in a different context, and she was not a woman who repeated herself when the first version had been sufficient. The ride back to Ironback was quiet in the way that certain kinds of quiet became the largest thing in a landscape. The clouds had moved off the western ridge entirely. The afternoon light was the clear, unsoftened quality of late May in Wyoming, the light that showed the country as it actually was rather than as weather modified it, and what it actually was considerable. Grass running to the ridgeline. The long open distance going past the point where going on seemed practical, and then continuing past that point in every direction. Wes rode on her left. Walt and the hands fell in behind. Nobody constructed conversation because constructed conversation would have been a reduction of what had just happened. And all 5 of them understood this without it being said. That evening the work on Ironback Ranch did not carry the quality of an arrangement being honored. It carried the quality of people doing what was theirs to do because it was theirs. The tasks were the same tasks they had been the 22 days before. The ground beneath the tasks had changed, and ground changed everything, whether or not you could point to the place where it changed. The morning of the 23rd of May was Wes Harlan's 30th birthday, and the last morning on which the condition in August Harlan's will could be satisfied, which was a legal fact. It was also the morning that had been building since a train platform in April, and a coffee cup going cold and a porch in lamplight, where a needle moved through canvas and 3 winters came forward into the present tense. which was a different kind of fact, and the more durable one. The Ironback yard before sunrise. Walt and the three hands were there before Wes and Ada came out, arranged in the loose line that had formed itself without instruction, hats in hand. The circuit preacher who served Rimrock Station on his rotating schedule was present because he was in town, and because Walt Briggs had sent word to him the previous afternoon, with the economy of a man who communicated exactly what was needed. Edna Marsh arrived with her husband and a covered tin she set on the porch rail without explanation. Her husband stood beside her with the expression of a man who had attended many occasions at his wife's instigation and had come to trust her assessment of which ones mattered. Before the preacher cleared his throat, before the hands shifted their weight or the morning arranged itself into ceremony, before any of it, Wes went inside. He was gone for 2 minutes. When he came back through the kitchen door, he was carrying the coat, not folded, open, held in both his large hands with the care you used for something, kept not because it was useful but because it was necessary. And the coat in his hands looked smaller than it was, because his hands were the size they were, which was the size of a man's hands after 10 years of the work that Ironback Ranch required. The canvas had the coloring of something that had been lived in seriously, the gray-brown of long exposure to weather that mattered. The stitching at the left shoulder was intact, small red shapes running their patient row across the mended place, unchanged by the blizzard and the 3 years in the trunk, and all the distance between that November night and this May morning. He stood in front of Ada and settled it around her shoulders without a word. Too large. It had always been too large for her. The night she had pulled it from her saddlebag in the dark on the Platte River corridor, she had not been thinking about fit. Standing in the Ironback yard with 12,000 acres of Wyoming grass at her back, and Walt Briggs and three hands with their hats pressed to their chests, and the preacher waiting with his book, the coat fell around her shoulders with a weight that was not only canvas. Too large was exactly right, because she was not the woman who had grabbed it off the saddlebag. She was the woman she had become in the years between that night and this morning, which was a distance that did not measure in miles. And the coat fit that distance without alteration. She felt the stitching under her right hand, where she reached up to adjust the collar. Her mother's pattern, her mother's birds, running their line across a repair made by hands that were gone now, on a coat Ada had worn for one storm-dark night, and left behind without looking back because she had cattle to find and a job to finish. Here it was on her shoulders in the Ironback yard, in the spring of 1879. Here she was, wearing it. She looked up at Wes. His face had come to the place it had been moving toward across 22 days. The place she had felt approaching in the set of him since the first morning at the hotel and had tracked without being able to name. Not grief, not the weight she had learned to read in him. Something that grief had been standing in front of, and had now, with the coat in her hands and the morning around them, stepped aside to allow through. The face of a man who has understood that he is permitted to put one of two things down. That putting it down does not reduce what he carried. That Ruth was real, and the carrying was real, and this morning was real, and all of those things were true at the same time in the same yard. Do you agree? Not the preacher's question, his own. The question that had been present since April. I agreed a while back. Her voice was steady and honest and not performing either of those things. I just needed time to read it right. The preacher said the words. They were the right words for the right occasion in the right yard on the right morning. And the Ironback yard held them with the simple solidity of ground that had been through weather and had stayed ground regardless. Walt shook Wes's hand when it was done. He held the grip for a moment with 11 years of the same land pressed into it, and something adjacent to relief. And then he turned and shook Ada's hand with the same grip, the same pressure, the same duration. Not a smaller version. The same, equal and unremarked, and she received it without comment because comment would have been smaller than what the gesture was. Edna Marsh uncovered the tin. Cake, because she ran a bakery and had decided before she left the house that the morning required it, and that was the whole of her reasoning, and it was sufficient. 3 weeks later, George Voss came up from Texas, because George Voss trusted his own observation over any written account from any source, including his daughter. He arrived on the morning train, the same platform, the same station agent, who greeted him with the careful courtesy of a man conducting himself with appropriate humility in the aftermath of a role he had not entirely been proud of playing. He spent 4 days at Ironback Ranch. He looked at the land the way he looked at everything, without hurry and without sentiment, with the focused attention of a man who had been reading country for 40 years, and understood that land told the truth about the people who worked it if you asked it the right way. He looked at the stock and the fencing and the ledger work Ada had reorganized, and the way the hands moved through their tasks and the way Wes Harlan moved through his. On the morning of the 4th day, riding the north fence line in the early light while Ada was occupied with the supply accounting she had been working through since the previous afternoon, George Voss said without preamble, "When you offered her the 30 days, did you know?" Wes considered this honestly, which was the only way he considered things. "I knew she was a person who looked at a man standing on a platform with flowers and decided he deserved to hear the news from a person rather than a letter. That was what I knew. A beat of the kind that did actual work. The rest came clear after." George Voss nodded once, the nod of a man who has received the answer he came to receive and has no further questions on the subject. He got his horse moving north along the fence line and did not bring it up again. He left on the Friday morning train. He shook Wes's hand at the platform with the grip of a man conducting a transaction that was also a verdict, and kissed Ada's forehead in the way he had done since she was old enough to remember, and boarded without looking back, because George Voss did not look back at things he had settled. On a Tuesday morning in late July, Ada woke before the light and lay still in the and took stock of herself with the honesty she applied to every situation she had been inside of across her 26 years. The inventory had been building across several mornings, each item in it accountable on its own terms. Together they had crossed a threshold during the night, in the way thresholds were crossed, gradually and then all at once. She lay still with this knowledge, the way her father had taught her to sit, with significant information, straight and without flinching, and long enough to understand what it actually was, before deciding what to do with it. She dressed and went to the porch before Wes was up. The eastern ridge was catching the first light in the slow way it caught it. Some mornings, no drama in it, just the gradual appearance of something that had been present in the dark, and was now becoming visible. She had watched that ridge from this porch across many mornings in the past weeks. This morning she watched it with the kind of attention you brought to ordinary things, when you understood that the number of ordinary mornings ahead of you had changed in a way that could not be unchanged. She heard Wes moving inside. The specific sounds of that specific man in that specific house. No lights yet. No hesitation. Just the settled navigation of someone who had lived in these rooms long enough to carry their shape in his body the way you carried familiar country. He came out with 2 cups of coffee, found her on the porch steps, sat beside her, handed her a cup, looked at the ridge. Ada put her hand over his on the step between them. She held it there. Wes went still in the way that was not alarm and was not confusion. The stillness of a man receiving information he understood completely, and was sitting with, not reaching for words, because the words available were all smaller than what the information was, and he was wise enough to know it. After a while he turned his hand under hers and held it back. That was the whole of it. Later that morning Walt saw Wes ride the south fence line, the fence along the lower pasture where the creek bent, and the ground went soft in spring, and the crossing was the one Wes had not chosen to make in April for 3 years running. He rode it at the pace of a man doing what needed doing on a piece of ground that was his. Not avoiding anything, not announcing anything, working his fence in the morning light. Walt watched from the barn doorway until Wes had cleared the near bend and was moving along the straight section toward the east. Then he went inside and got on with the morning, because he was not a man who narrated what he could simply observe, and what he had observed required nothing added. The coat hung on its peg by the kitchen door, not stored away, not displayed. Present the way functional things were present in a house that used what it kept, available to be seen on the way in from the barn and on the way out to the work. Canvas weathered to the color of long service. The small red birds running across the left shoulder in the line her mother had invented. Unchanged by everything that had happened to the coat since a November night on the Platte River corridor, and everything that had happened to the people connected to it since. Ada passed it every evening coming in from the last check of the day. Some evenings she touched the stitching at the left shoulder, because her mother had put it there, and her mother was gone now, and some things you touched to keep the connection present. Other evenings she simply walked past it, because the connection was present in the passing and did not need the touch, and her mother would have understood the difference between those two things without being told. 12,000 acres of Wyoming grass doing what grass did in every season it was given, growing toward whatever the season brought, rooting down hard enough to hold through whatever the season took away. That was enough.